These are certainly trying times, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty to provide frank and timely insights for life during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is the final webinar in this COVID-19 related webinar series. Stay tuned for more information to come about our next fall COVID-19 webinar series. For today's webinar, we're excited to have Professor and Chair of Literacy Studies in the School of Education, Dr. Elizabeth Dutro, here presenting the complexities of trauma and education in the time of COVID-19. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Elizabeth, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Elizabeth will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimal audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface, and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I am excited to introduce today's speaker. Elizabeth Dutro, PhD, is Professor and Chair of Literacy Studies in the School of Education. She has published extensively on issues of equity and retention to policy and practice in K-12 classrooms, and conducts her research in close collaboration with teachers and students. Her research examining how children draw on their life experiences, including trauma, as resources for their learning has been featured in several media outlets, including The Washington Post, Facing History and Ourselves, Colorado Public Radio, and the National Education Policy Center. Dr. Dutro is the author of the recent book, The Vulnerable Heart of Literacy, Centering Trauma as Powerful Pedagogy. She welcomes connection and can be contacted at elizabeth.dutro@colorado.edu or at Life a Story on Twitter. Welcome, Elizabeth, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Laurel. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today. Trauma is certainly a word we're increasingly hearing in education for good reason, and certainly now during the pandemic and its related impacts on families and communities. So my research is located in schools and classrooms and in collaboration with teacher colleagues. I came to this work because I was a student who navigated high school following the sudden death of my younger brother. And then I worked with children who were making their way in school in the midst of difficult experiences. Our research team's questions have focused on the presence of difficult experiences in classrooms, including how stories of students' lives enter and become known in school, which may or may not be in a student's control. And our primary focus is to study how literacy curriculum and instruction can be designed in ways that allow students to feel invited to draw on their life experiences as a valued resource for their learning. So as I said, my field is called literacy, and my work is grounded in the humanities. I think a lot about the stories that human beings are living and are always telling in various ways about ourselves and about others. As these words, next, Laurel. Thanks. As these words from the poet, scholar, and storyteller Gloria Anzaldúa capture, the stories we tell and that others circulate about us matter to how we're seen and who we get to be in various contexts. So I want to start with inviting us all to think about kids in our lives who are navigating the pandemic. And I'll share what I found myself writing when I thought of this launch for us today. In the height of spring lockdown, my 3-year-old niece says, "There is a badness now," as she moves a little closer, inch by inch, to see when the adults will halt her progress toward the auntie's arms that should be clutching her tight. And just a few weeks ago, as summer faded, I saw the photo appear on my phone of my nephew's first day of first grade, His head leaned as close as he could get to his new teacher and classmates on that glowing Chromebook screen. And I covered my face with my hands and let the tears fall. I share these stories because they are the least of the stories children and youth bring to their school lives now, the least of what teachers are navigating and feeling behind that camera and those masks. And stories of hard things are always entering schools and classrooms, let alone now during the impacts of COVID. What we've learned in my research with colleagues is that those difficult experiences, including trauma, hold potential for positive connection to one another, support for children and youth, and can fuel school learning. I'll share some examples of that as we go. I'm sorry, there's one back. Thank you. So I wanted to touch on a few ideas today. Why is the term trauma complex in context of education? And here I'll emphasize the importance of keeping that term complex. What are the multiple dimensions of trauma educators must consider in striving to be the most supportive and responsive to students? And how can the complexities of trauma fuel those positive connections and justice-centered pedagogy in classrooms? And here I'll discuss some ideas that would apply regardless of COVID impacts, as well as some thoughts and examples of COVID-specific stances and action. I want to be clear on why I find it so important to recognize the complexity of the word trauma and how it is used in relation to students in schools. That word is always heavy, with the certainty of hard things: hurt, loss, pain, despair, violence, oppression, to name but a few of the experiences it might suggest. And it is also a word that gets used to describe such a wide range of experiences that specificity is important if we're to respond in necessary and appropriate ways. To say that trauma is complex may seem obvious, yet the risks of oversimplifying or emphasizing some impacts over others can be consequential for students. So as I'll discuss more, we have to hold that complexity in front of mind always when we see trauma used in relation to students in schools. What we can always ask is, what counts as trauma? And what forms of life's challenges get deemed trauma, and for whom? So I want to turn to some of the layers of complexity when considering trauma in education. One is trauma as personal and as shared, trauma as part of the human condition and systemically targeted, and trauma as carried into institutions and inflicted by institutions like schools. It is important to consider how this time in history is collective and highly specific as a source of trauma for children and youth and their teachers. The virus is certainly saturated with pain, loss, and fear on a global, national, state, and community level. All children and youth are experiencing loss of the physical presence of some of their family members, as well as friends, teachers, mentors, coaches. Physical proximity matters in relationships. They are also missing many of the routines and structures of life that can provide a sense of order and security. Many students have had to process the cancellation of significant events, from high school graduations to summer camps, sporting events to theater performances, quinceañeras to pride festivities. At colleges and universities around the country, students have had to alter their expectations of what their year would hold for them, and that's hard. And of course, the media images and headlines are full of the despair and uncertainty of the crisis. It makes sense that students are carrying fear for loved ones and possibly themselves. Those aspects of the pandemic are shared. Given that, you can see why there are reports of increased social isolation and mental health challenges for children and young people. And considering those as impacts many would experience makes sense. And so some responses that apply to all students are crucial. I'll share some of those in a later slide. And of course, the challenges embedded in the experience of the pandemic are also highly specific and personal to individual children and youth and their families. I'll turn to impacts on specific communities in the next slide, but for individuals, some students are mourning loved ones who have died of COVID-19 or are grappling with the fear that an ill family member may not get well. Many have seen one or both parents lose their jobs and felt the impact of compounded economic hardship. Those are just some examples of what individual students may be experiencing as they engage in school this fall. Turning to trauma as part of the human condition and systemically targeted, we can certainly agree that no human being gets through life unscathed. Human bodies are finite and fragile, so loss and grief and physical and emotional pain happens in all lives in some form. Humans find ways to inflict trauma on one another in ways that impact many people across identities and communities. We can think of other examples of hard things that someone may experience by virtue of living as a human. However, the traumas embedded in the experience of the pandemic are a good example of how hardship, pain, and loss is not the same across communities and circumstances. This is another way trauma is specific, but this also points to how trauma is targeted. Those targeted traumas arise from the systems of societies and institutions that create or exacerbate pain, loss, and struggle. We know, for example, that none of the COVID impacts have been equally distributed. Communities of color are disproportionately taking the brunt of this pandemic for reasons embedded in centuries of oppression. The pain and grief students of color are carrying as we move through these months, particularly Black students, is further magnified by the ongoing murders of Black people that are fueling crucial recent protests against police violence and amplified movements for anti-racism and systemic change. We know Black parents, families, and communities are wrapping children and youth in support, but now that students are back to school, whether on screen or in person, teachers who do not share students' racial identities and the trauma of racism, white teachers like me, must commit to anti-racism so we can bring awareness, advocacy, and the keenest compassion to supporting students. Many approaches to trauma in relation to schools focus on trauma as issues that are carried into schools. All approaches certainly argue that schools may need to change in response to students' trauma, but there's less emphasis in some of the trauma-informed schools conversation on how schooling inflicts trauma on students. And this is also a targeted trauma because students of color, particularly Black and Latinx students, are far more likely to experience institutional harm. We know from decades of research that there are long-standing and entrenched patterns of inequity in schooling. Research studies in education investigate bias, racism, sexism, homophobia, and disability discrimination in curriculum, instruction, and educational policies. Those policies range from federal, national level to state, local district, to individual schools, and even specific classrooms. Discipline policies are a good example of how entrenched racial injustices are in schooling. For instance, you might have seen the recent news story of the 12-year-old Black child in Colorado Springs who had police sent to his home for holding a toy gun during online school. That situation, terrifying and certainly traumatizing for the family and the child, arises from policies and from false assumptions about that child and his family. How does institutional trauma persist for so long in schooling? There are many reasons we know, but systems in the language of schools that exacerbate inequity can become invisible, as they can seem to be just the way it is. So for example, we can think about how easily children and youth can become labeled, whether academically or behaviorally, emotionally, etc., through language that just seeps into the way schools operate, a kind of shorthand that reduces a complex, knowledgeable person to, quote, a low kid or a high kid or a problem kid. I wanted to share a couple of images that convey some of the risk we have to guard against when creating programs meant to address trauma. The language around those deemed traumatized can quickly become focused on damage and brokenness and the need to fix students. This can be exacerbated when neuroscience is used to show how trauma impacts the brain and thus cognition. Images of brain scans literally locate damage inside of individual students. I'm not about questioning that science for sure, but many studies show the power of images in influencing human perspective. So images and the language around them can exacerbate those narratives of damage that can further marginalize students. This argues for bringing a discerning eye and questioning stance to how trauma is approached in various programs and frameworks schools might adopt. A brain scan or a graphic representation of levels and stages and risks can play a role, but we have to realize that they impose their own logic on us, even when the capabilities and knowledge and insight we experience from children and youth defy that logic embedded in that representation. So how can we ensure we are being discerning and approaching trauma in schools, particularly when programs are created or adopted by districts? Here are some questions teachers and I have come to. Who benefits from this? Whose perspectives are being heard and honored here? How is the world being divided in this language in ways that benefit some more than others? What is being made invisible? What is valuable and serves students well? What needs to be questioned and resisted? These are important questions for many issues in education, and certainly for something as crucial and complex as trauma. And again, policies and programs that hold potential for harm or for positioning students as damaged land most harshly on students of color. So in the context of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement and ongoing protests, anti-racism is central to being careful about how trauma is considered in schools. Next. There are important principles for supporting students within trauma's complexity. These I've gleaned from the work and perspectives of many educators, students, and justice-based organizations. And as we can see, these are stances and actions that are beneficial for all students. So we can place care, compassion, and humanity at the center of decisions, understand and actively try to change sources of institutional trauma, cultivate relationships with students and families, and ensure students feel seen as an individual, view and position students as capable and knowledgeable, strive to ensure every student has a place where they can retreat within the school, a safe space, or safe people for them. Connect students with resources for support, while also embracing that every adult should be a support. It's not about sending issues down the hallway to someone else, but it's both and. Advocate for students, including active pursuit of anti-racism, and check in with them and then circle back, and be flexible and prioritize well-being over perhaps some policies around late work, things like that, particularly during the impacts of COVID. So with that framing of the complexity of trauma in mind, I want to turn now to classrooms and talk about some of the learning experiences we were designing and studying. So to start, I want to think about how all of what kids and adults are experiencing right now are integral to the story of each life and the larger story of life in schools at this time. It is significant that students and teachers are all navigating this pandemic, even as the impacts certainly vary. Teachers' experiences of the crisis are a central resource for connecting with students, demonstrating value of students' lives and knowledge, and supporting them in learning in the midst of this challenging time. In our research, teacher colleagues and I found that when educators shared stories from their own lives in classrooms, students were much more likely to draw on life experiences as a resource for their learning. Too often, considerations of trauma in schools position teachers as only healers and students as only wounded and the ones in need of healing. That is, of course, a false distinction, and it can fuel that false and harmful assumption of brokenness of students. However, when teachers allow children and youth to witness their struggles, their humanity, their vulnerabilities, students are positioned as active participants in a reciprocal process of being present as witnesses for one another. In addition, teacher sharing helps to demonstrate to students that all aspects of life belong in school, that they are seen, heard, and valued in the classroom, and that their experiences matter as a source of knowledge. This will matter all the more given the experiences that will accumulate for students and their teachers during this crisis. And this can occur online, in written messages to students, recorded videos to particular students, or to the whole class, and synchronous interactions on screen. I was with my nephew for online first grade the other day, and when he went to art class in the afternoon, looking pretty draggy after a long day on screen, his art teacher greeted him enthusiastically, noticed him individually, and said, "It is so amazing to see you, Miles. I miss you." Miles just beamed and his whole body sprang to life. What we all want is for kids to feel central, included, seen, and heard. But of course, it is not a straightforward project to make the difficult aspects of life matter in ways that support the child. Students who have experienced trauma often face a conundrum. They may sense in school that a salient, traumatic, crucial event from life might not be welcome in that space. But at the same time, if the child would accept an invitation to bring that experience into school in some way, they get no guarantees it will be met with respect, empathy, compassion, and critical advocacy. So what can we do to ensure children can feel the invitations and make them assurances about how it will be met? Educators certainly need tangible and actionable practices, as well as resources and collaboration with one another. In my research on pedagogies that are responsive to trauma, we found these features to be key: center relationships with students and with families, involve active commitment to equity, justice, and advocacy for students. These approaches are reciprocal in vulnerability and in trust, and they can be woven into the fabric of classrooms, including curriculum and instructional practice. They're not an add-on program. So next, I'll turn to those approaches that arose in our work with students. And today I'm going to focus in on some examples of what we've explored related to those last two ideas. As I said, teachers' experiences and the way they share them matter in classrooms related to trauma. I'll share some examples from a second grade classroom today, taught by a close and wonderful teacher colleague and collaborator. And it is important to know that all of these examples occurred as part of official instruction. In other words, as part of lessons that would be taught in literacy. What shifts is not the learning goals of the lesson or the focus on particular aspects of literacy emphasized in the lesson, but on the kinds of connections to life experiences students are invited to make. So Megan shared this story in a lesson in writing. It was a lesson on genre, and in this case, personal narrative. Megan would have been writing in front of her students, what we call modeling writing, no matter what the content. The shift here is that the content was about losing her grandfather. She wrote, "The sad day. It was a sunny, warm August afternoon. Catherine and I were inside trying to stay cool when the phone rang. I looked to see who was calling. It was Aunt Betsy. I remember thinking, what on earth could she be calling about? When I answered, I knew immediately something was wrong. Where are your parents? I've been trying to get a hold of them," she asked. She explained that Papa had collapsed as he was leaving church. He was gone. I felt tears well up in my eyes. My stomach lurched. As we'll see, it is the larger themes of loss and fear in this story that some of these young children took up as invitation to write about meaningful stories from their lives. We've found that small shifts in content can make a huge difference in how students will respond. So after Megan's lesson, when children then wrote their own narratives, they took up topics ranging from lost pets to fears for family members serving in the military, to a grandfather's death, to a quarrel with friends. And some children wrote of the threats their families face from systems, such as immigration policies, like Laura's story here, as well as complex feelings about law enforcement. When Laura writes of her uncle's deportation and its ripple effects on her family, her story speaks back to the policies and rhetoric around immigration in the United States. She wrote the sad story. I need to tell you something. I heard my uncle say something to my dad. I thought that it was going to be something good, but it was not so good news. He said, I'm going to work the whole weekend in a far place. Then on Monday afternoon, he went with his whole company to eat. They were waiting for the food. Then the police came. Woo, woo. The police got out of his car and said, who has identification? But my uncle didn't have one. So he and 4 people had to go to jail. But then the police left him in Mexico. Now my auntie is leaving to Mexico because my uncle is in Mexico. It is not the same thing without them, because they always used to come and visit us. And when it was Christmas, he would bring lots of presents and he would say to do some tamales, and we would. Along with important content, we see the writer's craft that children bring to their writing. Laura deftly does what poets and storytellers so wish to do, building immediate investment, a sense of urgency, of anticipation of what might be coming next. The details of her story follow her pull of her reader into intimacy. I need to tell you something. She starts with words reserved for trusted friends, sharing something she overheard in adult conversation, a sense that this was not meant for her ears. Laura recreates the chaos and alarm of a routine work lunch shattered. She weaves in dialogue throughout that conveys tone, as well as the intricacies and intimacies of her family relationships. Laura's story also illustrates how we so often see small elements of the teacher's modeled writing in students' responses, even as they personally shape the invitation to their own lives. This is very different than what we've found with more generic texts intended to model certain aspects of writing for children that may be included with curriculum, or when a teacher even models writing that focuses on topics such as going to the park or taking a family vacation, where students will often take up the specific topic and almost all of the details of those stories. In the case of this writing lesson, it was striking, too, how many versions of Megan's title traveled across topics in children's writing, from Laura's here to the saddest sad day, that one was about a pet turtle that had died, to flipping the title completely to the happiest day. In the invitations opened up, time and again, we see how the lost pet still matters, may matter a lot, but the lost grandfather, the missed uncle, are also literally on the page as possibility. Those possibilities allow writers' ideas and connections to proliferate, which allow knowledge of the very hardest stuff of life to be resources for school learning. In this example, one child's experiences and the ways he was sharing it with his classmates were the motivation for a writing project Megan designed that she built around the book, The Lemonade Club. This child had been through a lot before coming to her classroom, including being separated from his biological family, separation from all but one of his siblings, and incomprehensibly, a cancer diagnosis just 2 weeks before his first day of 2nd grade in his new school. The book chronicles a school year in which first a child and then the teacher are diagnosed with cancer, and their illness and treatment unfold in relationship with each other and their classroom community. So it was very resonant with what Megan's student was going through. After reading that book, and over the course of a few weeks, the children in Megan's classroom brainstormed and wrote about topics for a lemonade narrative on an experience the children chose as an example of life's sweeter moments, and a lemon narrative on an experience the child would identify as challenging in whatever way they chose to define that. Here, I showed the list of lemon and lemonade topics written by the child I had mentioned. This child's lemons list includes having cancer, having to leave his brothers when he was moved to his foster home, while his lemonade, and the one he chose to share with his classmates, focuses on his foster parents' care through his cancer, and that he can see his brothers more often thanks to his new location. His list reveals something we've consistently noticed. Trauma and sources of connection and sustenance, even joy, are bound up together in children's writing and talk. Children reveal the pain in connection and the connection in pain and the joy in what is unquestionably painful. His painful events have a counterpart on his sweeter list. In other words, sidelining the challenging experiences can also exclude what the child feels as most sweet. In this example, these are poems students wrote following a poetry lesson in which Megan shared a poem she composed in the form of a 10 things about. It could be about someone or it could be about something. She wrote about her dog that she lost and was missing. What we can notice here is that pattern we found of children connecting their own writing to the deeper themes of the original text, and that some children do also take up the specific topic. For instance, here we have a poem about a child's dog. We also have one about the turtle that died, a grandfather who had passed away, and a child separated from his father due to incarceration. So while Megan definitely had doubts and worries that it might seem as though she was drawing equivalency between experiences, the loss of a dog versus some of the trauma children were experiencing, what we've learned is that it is about sharing experiences that matter deeply, and children respond with empathy in the moment and then often choose to bring connection to those significant themes in their writing. It opens a space, as the children's writing shows. But it means that those deeper themes have to be present and intentionally shared in the text teachers choose and use in classrooms. Turning to another genre, letter writing proved to be a powerful context for children to bring their hard experiences to their literacies. In fact, given what we learned, even if the official curriculum doesn't include letter writing, as not all of them do, I encourage it as a literacy activity, even a one-day event. As her modeled writing for the unit on letters, Megan wrote a lovely letter to her grandfather, who had recently passed away. It could seem to be a simple decision, but it was designed with intention and was incredibly powerful for some children. You could feel the children's attention ignite when Megan said she was writing to someone who could not receive her letter. Many children then chose to write a letter to someone who was absent from their lives, and those letters were often showcases for children's effective use of many elements that make for powerful writing, including metaphor and imagery and voice. We can look at Naya's gorgeous letter to her baby brother. Dear baby brother, I am really sad you died. I wish I can talk to you, and I wish you were still alive. It's like you never existed. I want to know if you can wear mittens. Jovan, I really miss you. I hope that you really miss me. I want to ask you questions, but you won't reply. I'm feeling happy, but sad because you died. I know you would be in kindergarten. I love you so much. One time I had a dream that you were alive and I was so happy. I really love you. If you've lost someone dear to you, you will recognize that tension Naya captures between it's like you never existed and that person's enduring presence with you. You'll resonate with how her pairing of I'm feeling happy, but sad because you died captures the sense that happiness is never the absence of sadness, which is a sensation so commonly felt after such a loss. Naya is like a bronze letter to his father here, and so many examples I could share are expressions of trauma and are powerful uses of literacy that children opt to pursue in school. In a final example, as part of our analysis, we trace echoes of trauma across children's school writing over the course of a school year. We've learned the importance of taking a long view in how children are responding in sometimes subtle ways over time. Enrique's writing is one example. We knew Enrique's beloved teenage cousin had passed away the previous year. Early in the school year, Enrique's cousin appeared first on a list of possible topics he might write about. This was from his lemon list, by the way, that I mentioned earlier. My cousin Miguel died, I broke my arm, uncle or grandmother died, I chipped and hit the side of my chin, baby chickens died. We noticed his cousin also appears in free writing portions of his writing journal over time, like one about family and playing video games that includes the cousin as a character. At one point, Enrique chose a topic from his list related to death and loss, but the deaths of baby chickens. Then, when they were learning about and writing poetry later that year, he wrote this poem. My cousin Miguel died. He was my bestest cousin of all my other cousins. I don't know why he died, but I will keep him in one place, my heart. I'll always keep him there. I'll never take him out. It wasn't until later in the year that he chose to write explicitly about his cousin's death, but you can see the echoes in earlier work. Our study of children's response to instruction that is designed to be responsive to and inclusive of students' challenging experiences emphasize approaches that position students as witnesses to others' life experiences, invite but never require students to draw on the fullness of their lives as valued resource and source of knowledge for school. It is crucial to note that students are never required to write about a particular topic. They always, every time, have choice in what they take up and how they interpret an invitation. And also, it allows teachers to identify larger themes for connection and invitation, and in turn allow children to see their life experiences as central to what matters in school. These lessons I've shared are not happening every day. They are happening periodically, regularly enough to keep a consistent sense that a full range of life experiences are valued as important and are honored in school. And these approaches to instruction are nested in classrooms where teachers are committed to the actions and stances I discussed earlier and include on this slide. I'll emphasize too that when vibrant connections happen in classrooms, classrooms are joyful places. These windows into this classroom, you can know exist in that kind of vibrant space. Of course, no approaches in and of themselves assure students trust or noticeable shifts in response to interactions or activities in the classroom, which makes us always know that these approaches are a process, not an event. So these few examples I've shared are with elementary age students, but the principles cross all grade levels and subject areas. Teaching and learning are emotional and relational across the board. So we have to challenge the idea that only certain content areas demand those investments. What our teacher team and many other researchers have found in secondary classrooms and for college students is that no matter the content, students feel valued and supported when teachers demonstrate trust, invest in relationships, position students as knowledgeable, and advocate for them in the school. Those qualities of teaching are central within the ideas and actions related to the trauma of the pandemic and the traumas of racism I discussed earlier. Let me be clear too, that we know these things because of teachers who do these things. Teachers are the leaders, of course, in these efforts. So what are some of the everyday small ways this happens in classrooms? It could be acknowledging to students when it's hard to focus or concentrate because of what we're feeling. Because as teachers, we are definitely feeling that it's hard to focus and concentrate these days. We could launch the day or a class period with even a small snippet of pointing to something that inspired or brought joy or was frustrating from everyday life. Or inviting students to check in with a word or a phrase or a GIF that conveys how they're feeling at that moment, and seeking out individual students, of course, to simply ask, how are you doing? This has to be genuine, of course. We have to trust students enough to be vulnerable with them, as well as listen to students with love and hold ourselves accountable to learn from students' experiences. And inviting students' hard stories as a valued source of connection in school has to be joined with commitments to advocate for students' humanity in schools and communities. These commitments are always crucial in classrooms, but they are all the more essential given the impacts of COVID. And with that, that's the end, except that I just have to give huge appreciation for teachers who are working hard to support students in such trying and exhausting circumstances. And I look forward to conversation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As we move into Q&A, a reminder to submit any questions through the Q&A interface in the webinar. Our first question comes from Evan. How do we help our current CU students get through the next year during a traumatic pandemic?
Oh, Evan, I just like feel every word of that question. It's what I most want to do as someone who supports students. And, you know, I think back to some of those principles that I kind of shared throughout. And I just think, I do think like just being sure that students know they're not alone, that everyone is struggling, and that, you know, sometimes the facades that we might feel we need to have as teachers or instructors, that we always have it together, it's okay to share. It's quite good to share. We know this is a challenging time, and all those things around being sure students know you know them as individuals, sending them notes, making eye contact on Zoom, sending them little videos is something that is possible to do at a distance. Those are just some ideas, but I really feel your question. I'm right there with you thinking about that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from David. How do feelings differ between typical kids and special needs kids?
Oh, that's interesting. I love that question. I have to say, that is not my area of expertise, so I don't want to pretend that it is. I do think, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is that whatever feelings the child is demonstrating mean that that's the feeling to be right in there with them and support them through, kind of regardless of the child. But again, my expertise is not in students with special needs in particular. So I don't want to get specific, but I really value that question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This question also comes from David. How will remote learning affect non-traditional learners and students' access to creative outlets?
Yeah, David, you're asking such important questions. I think students with special needs and non-traditional learners are just, this is hard. There's no way around it, that this is hard. And it's hard on families because of all of the pressures on families in online learning regardless. And then the extra support that families need to just pour into students who do have special learning needs. So while I don't think there's an easy response, I do know that some districts are trying to be very mindful of connecting families with safe ways to get additional support for students. And that is for sure worth checking out.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our next question comes from Anne. Can you share about how this impacts early childhood education and educators?
Yeah, and that's excellent to think about. And I think that when you say early childhood, I'm gonna think preschool. And I think what we've seen is that preschools have been some of the earliest contexts of schooling to open. And you can see why, because parents need to work. And preschoolers need a lot of hands-on attention. So to support early education teachers, I mean, I think of myself as a parent, that my kids are older, but as an auntie, I think about just like appreciating and supporting what teachers are going through right now, what they're planning and how they're supporting those little ones in the context where they're able to support them in person or required to support them in person. I think very much again, the principles that we talked about throughout the webinar apply to those early childhood classrooms and supporting children and teachers in those contexts too. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our next question comes from Kate. What if we feel like a student needs more than we can give them in Zoom classroom? What should we look out for? How do we introduce the idea of using on-campus mental health resources to a student we are concerned about?
Oh, that's so important. And, you know, I think to respond, I'll probably make some assumptions that might not be the case, but it sounds like it's a student who you have access to in terms of relationship, so that you could just set up, it's not the same through Zoom as it is when we can be with students in person, but set up a time when you can communicate to that student one-on-one. And it sounds like you do have some concerns, and maybe you can invite them to talk about how they're doing. And I think if it's campus, or maybe it's a high school, you said campus, there are so many resources available, but we really have to seek those out and have them at the ready with students. I've been in your shoes. I have had those conversations, but I've been able to have them in person. And, you know, sometimes it's following up. Sometimes it's even helping them, sitting with them. That could happen on Zoom as they call for those appointments or access those resources. That also implies trust, which it sounds like you are a teacher who is really working to build that trust with that student. Those are some things that come to mind. But all of these questions just make me think about how hard things are right now, and how we're all in this process of trying to puzzle it through. And thank goodness for contexts like this that give us a chance to collaborate, because even from the questions themselves, I learn better how to support students.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We are moving into our final question. This question comes from Bernie. Do you feel, or I'm sorry, this question comes from Ellen. What can be done to minimize the long-term effect of this trauma?
Yeah. First of all, it's right, you get that feeling of just how long will this last? And then what will the aftermath be? And just from my experience, spending lots of time with children and with teachers, I think it is in not having amnesia about what's happened, but continuing to check in, continuing to tap those stories of living through this, even after it seems to be, you know, we can hope in our past. You're so right that children and youth and college-age students, all of us, are going to be holding this experience as part of our life, as part of our life story. It will impact us, no matter our circumstances, but particularly if there are a lot of personal impacts. And I think circling back and not letting that get lost be really important.
Thanks so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. And thank you again to Elizabeth for this great information.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. At this time, we invite you to provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or other CU Boulder alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at www.colorado.edu/business/alumni. Stay tuned for forthcoming information on our next COVID-19 webinar series. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and go Buffs.